It's fair to say no one state acting alone has the leverage or the buying power or the market to take any one of these important cutting-edge technologies to scale. But many states acting together probably could, completely absent of federal action. And Barry mentioned the renewable portfolio standards. Right now, 40% of U.S. electricity supply is under a renewable portfolio standard. That's a very big slice of the U.S. electricity market. And we could probably convert that, looking at what the RPS has called for, into how many megawatt hours or megawatt capacity of renewable energy is going to have to be developed to meet those standards, and I'm sure it's significant, but I don't have the number at my fingertips. Also, for the California auto tailpipe standards, there's about, I think, 10 states that have said they're going to copy that. If all of those states were effective in implementing those policies, you'd have 33% of the U.S. auto market with a CO2 tailpipe standard, basically driving technology changes in the auto industry. And I bet 33% of the U.S. auto market is a pretty significant share of the global auto market, but I'll leave that to somebody else to calculate. So I think it's fair to say that states actually could, a number of states acting on a similar policy, not necessarily in coordination or cooperation, but implementing similar policies actually could affect the market changes that would bring these technologies to scale. Now, if the states really can't do it, then others might argue that the ultimate virtue of all this state climate policy development and innovation is affecting the shape and timing of federal policy. In other words, all the state policy stuff is great. It's building information. It's creating institutions, setting price signals, but it's never really going to get us to the solution. What we really need is for the states to ultimately force the federal government to act. And on that particular point, some of us at WRI and our friend Paul Bozer from George Mason University have been doing some research on state policy innovation in a variety of areas. Energy and environment is one area where we looked, but we also looked at non-energy and environment policies, including things like gun control laws and education testing and other policies like that. And we looked historically at about 11 different cases where states were innovative and implementing policies in advance of the federal government, and then subsequent to that, the federal government acted, essentially, picking up what the states were doing and implementing it through federal legislation. And we sort of we're asking the questions. So midway through this research, so we have some preliminary conclusions, but we're kind of asking the questions like, what was it about that state action and the interaction between states and the feds that enabled this policy diffusion to occur? And specifically, in an academic sense, we're talking about vertical diffusion from the states to the federal level, as opposed to horizontal diffusion among states. And we're looking at a number of things. We looked at 7 factors in particular we pulled out, and one was policy learning. Did the ideas and information, the power of example at the state level actually then trigger the feds to act? The development of empirical cost data, what we call the spillover effect, the extent to which the costs and benefits of the policy actually go far beyond an individual state border and then really necessitate a federal response. We looked at the extent of horizontal state-to-state diffusion, federal assistance to states, business support for federal uniformity, and lastly, a push for diffusion to the federal level by the state champions themselves. These are the 7 factors that we looked at across these various case studies. And a few preliminary conclusions that we found, actually, the great deal of frequency in terms of seeing the successful diffusion occur, a very high frequency of state champions pushing for the federal adoption, particularly in tandem with the other factor, what we call the spillover effect, where the costs and benefits of the policy actually fall beyond an individual state border, and in fact, a state that is trying to implement a policy and achieve a policy goal is really undermined by the fact that other states around it maybe are not adopting that similar policy. So those 2 factors, particularly in tandem, seem to have a strong impact on the federal government acting. We also saw policy learning being significant in a number of cases. But interesting, to steal Paul's words, the dog that didn't bark here was the development of empirical cost data. In the cases that we looked at, we did not see what seems like a sort of intellectually appealing argument that, oh, well, the states act, you get 5 years of empirical cost data, the feds look at that and like, oh, we can do this and pass a law. We actually don't see it anywhere. In fact, there's one case where we saw the reverse, where the costs actually looked to be worse than people had anticipated, and the feds went at it anyway. So wrapping up my thoughts on it, two remaining points. In a preliminary, in this analysis that we're doing of vertical policy diffusion, we noted that in the 6 energy and environment cases that we looked at, 5 of the 6 resulted in the federal government instituting partial preemption, meaning the federal government set a floor that all 50 states had to meet, but allowed states individually to choose to exceed that floor if they wanted to. I think a very interesting outcome, and it raises this possibility that there may, in fact, in our federal system be really a policy cycle going on. And as we could revert back to climate policy and think about, what is it that is bogging the federal government down here? Why can't the federal government seem to move? We talk about that all day, but let's just say that for some reason the states can move much more quickly than the federal government in innovating and implementing climate policy. There could be a long-term cycle at play here where the states will create a patchwork, the federal government will step in with partial preemption, create a floor that bring all 50 states up to that floor and allow states to then continue to exceed that floor, in which case you then have a new cycle of patchwork. And perhaps, again, states always sort of at the leading edge, setting the bar, setting the standards, with the federal government coming in behind and bringing all the other states up to that standard. I have no idea if that's how it's going to play out, but an interesting thought to dwell on. And then lastly, we've talked a lot about the RGGI cap and trade system in the Northeast and the California tailpipe standards. We do look at that in our research. And these policies do seem to have the hallmarks, based on our research, of probably having very strong influence on the timing and the shape of federal policy. And we'll elaborate that more on our manuscript, which should be published in about 2.5 months. So thank you for the opportunity to provide those thoughts.
Good, thank you, Andrew. Well, we have a good amount of time for some discussion on some very stimulating presentations. I ask that you use a microphone and let us know who you are so that our web folks can tune in as well. Stacy, why don't we start with you? Here comes the mic, and then we'll just move right around.
Hi, great, thanks a lot. A couple of things, I think. Just a brief comment and a question. I thought for both of your presentations and a bit for the papers, that I think it's critical that you front load that the importance of the federal logjam, right? And the reason is, for the kind of discussion you're having, is because even for civic engagement, right? As citizens in a federal democracy, we actually have, our fallback position is that our government should in fact be acting in the general interest. We all have our basic democratic theory here in the room, right? And so it's a de facto expectation that they should be doing something. When we have to become civically engaged to change the direction of the ship, right, that's when this is in part a product of our sense that the government is not acting in the interests of the general population or the future or something, right? So I think it's sort of important to front load how important it really is that the position of the federal government is not just slow, but actually quite actively opposed in many respects to doing something about what so many people think is a critical problem. And so I mean, I think that position is really important. And I think the nuclear terrorism analogy is a great one because in fact it answers the counterfactual as well. What happens if the president and major political leaders in the Senate, not minor political leaders in the Senate, frankly, say important things way out front of the mainstream? That is, what happens when you get real national political leadership and they compete for it, like we heard about California on the, right? And that so dramatically changes the tenor of democratic engagement and what people feel they should be doing civically and at the state level. And so I mean, I think it's really important that we don't just kind of operate on the understanding that it matters that it's a critical underlying thing at the federal level, but that the actual intransigence is important. So the question is, whether or not you see, in Barry's work he uses the sort of notion of framing in your discussion of civic engagement. If you could give us some examples of what seem to be sort of effective frames for localizing some of these issues in particular states, and some of the variety of those are at the local and state level.
Okay, why don't we again take a couple questions and then do it. So we'll move to Michelle and over there. Or actually, why don't you do the inside first since you're right next to it. Thanks, Kat.
Hi, thank you. Amy Royden-Bloom with the National Association of State and Local Clean Air Officials. So I found this utterly fascinating. I have questions for both Barry and Susie. Barry, I'm sure you know Montana also is developing a climate change action plan, and you mentioned the Southeast is not being very active, but North Carolina is developing a climate action plan, and not led by their governor. This is actually something the legislative branch pushed forward, and the Air Quality Division is moving forward. And of prime interest to them is energy economic development. They have a lot of hog farms. They're looking at using the methane from that to create energy. Also, some of the recommendations are, let's start make our universities the high-tech centers. So they're seeing the real driver as economic development rather than the gloom and doom of the Outer Banks disappearing, although that's motivating some people as well. One of the interesting dynamics I see is that which branch takes the lead on climate? Is it the air quality branch or the energy branch? And that plays, for the air quality people, a lot of the actions that help reduce greenhouse gases also reduce criteria pollutants. So you see kind of co-benefits from that. For the energy people, it's energy supply is more of an issue. The question I have for Barry is localities, and I don't know if you've looked at that action. Recently, these groups petitioned the Supreme Court to review the decision that EPA does not have authority to regulate greenhouse gases, and the U.S. Conference of Mayors, the National Association of Counties, joined that lawsuit, which I found very interesting. And then, as you know, about 217 localities have signed on to the U.S. Mayor's Climate Agreement. I just wondered if you looked into what are the political dynamics behind that. For Susie, on the civic action point, have you been talking to any of the states that are developing climate action plans? I think they would find it very helpful to hear your message, because I think they need stakeholder support so that when they do these things that maybe are a little bit pushing forward, like in North Carolina, they know that their governors will get reelected. So they do need to make sure that the stakeholders within the state are behind this. Thanks.
Okay, great. If you could pass it to Michelle, that'd be great. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Michelle Betzel from Colorado State University, and actually following up on those questions as well. My questions are for Barry, and it's not because I'm not interested in what Susie had to say. I've actually had the chance to hear Susie's stuff before, so Barry's stuff is newer to me. You mentioned that the Southeast is a laggard on climate policy, and I wondered if that's a historical trend. And so when we've heard about the New England and California, those historically are policy innovators, right? So there's a historical trend. Is the Southeast a usual laggard on other policy areas, like what Andrew was talking about? Or is this something specific to climate change, or kind of talk about that a little bit more? And then I also wanted to hear more about the linkages between cities and counties and the state work that you've done, and what are the politics behind that, and you know, which way do causal arrows go, and kind of what are the relationships that develop, if any, or are those really kind of separate but parallel processes?
Okay, great. Barry, why don't you kick off our discussion?
Sure. All good questions. Let me try to take them to some extent in reverse order. I don't think I'll get to all of them. The local, county, municipal piece is an intriguing one, both in terms of the sheer number and the kinds of interjurisdictional network like the counties that you mentioned. And this is one area where I would argue that whereas we see tremendous difference in terms of levels of engagement between states and provinces, we see heavy involvement from American municipalities and Canadian counterparts. And in fact, even more in terms of north-south conversation about some of these pieces. At the same time, for constitutional and other reasons, many municipalities and counties have restrictions on the range of activities compared to states or compared to provinces. And so I think the emphasis at the municipal level has been much more on lead by example. I'm a native Chicagoan, and Mayor Daley's growing grass on the roof of City Hall. It just sort of blows my mind, but it's happening. And we see a lot of that, and yet sort of creative tweaking and looking at some of this activity. That's one point. A second point is I have been surprised at the relatively limited degree of conversation. It's almost a part of the federalism conversation, how just as there are some real questions about how much communication is taking place between state and federal and hooking all of this up one way or another, how in many instances you have fairly active cities in fairly active states, and they aren't necessarily coordinated or in conversation with one another. Even in some cases, ironically, where the city is the state capital. So there's
some where that is happening.
That's right.
Importantly.
And actually, yes, Portland is a great example. So there is that entirely separate piece that probably warrants a separate discussion. On the issue of laggards, there's actually a massive political science literature on subnational policy diffusion going back to the 1960s. And throughout the 20th century, the Southeast has been a laggard. I mean, you can come up with aggregate output scores and the whole bit, stuff that political scientists love to do. And for all the changes and transformations of the Southeast over the last 35 years politically, the Southeast is the laggard. There may be particular concerns in this area because of very intensive fossil fuel dependency, relatively limited promise for some renewables, and less capacity to work in those political contexts and situations. But as Amy mentions, I think the North Carolina case is really an intriguing one, and driven largely by the economic considerations as opposed to other pieces. Just quickly to come back to the point that you raised, Stacy, with regard to framing. I don't think that can be underemphasized, and there's several different directions we might take it, but I do want to suggest that even though the U.S. federal government has clearly been disengaged on climate policy for a long time, and it's been a long time since there was any significant prospects that Kyoto would pass the Senate. I mean, like 1998, I think. There are things that the federal government has done for states. Substantial transfer funds to build capacity at state energy departments and state environmental agencies that Canada, for the most part, has not done in the 1990s or more recently. Or the incredible expertise and in-house capacity that's been developed for emissions trading, and the technologies and tools and skills, so that when you go into any state, they've all done trading, whether it's NOx, SO2, other kinds of mechanisms or provisions. If you go to most Canadian capitals, that has not been there, given a Canadian federal decision in conventional air emissions and the like, to either do some version of command and control with kind of loose evasion at the end, or pure voluntarism, but an aversion to that. So it's a tool issue, but it's also a cultural issue. And I'm going to stop there and let my colleagues speak. Sorry.
Should I pick up on the framing issue maybe? I guess maybe the first which I want to start with is the issue of the terrorism threat. Since 2001, you see a phenomenon in communication of climate change that was not there ever before, and that is the comparison, the direct linking of climate change in comparison to terrorism. It's a threat bigger as, or at least as big as, terrorism. Katrina was a weapon of mass destruction. I mean, those kinds of terms. And the messengers is like people like Hans Blix or Gorbachev or, Tom Woolsey. I mean, people who are sort of, commonly associated with national security, with terrorism issues, they become speakers on climate change. It's a phenomenon that wasn't there before. I actually think this is not only or easily a positive development. And the reason I think that is, in some sense, the reason why we responded, the U.S. responded as much as it did to terrorism, is because it was a fear appeal, deeply, very much a fear appeal, and we had a response. We're going to war. We're having a war on terrorism. It was a rallying cry. There was a fear appeal and an answer, which is exactly why I said when they work, right? If you appeal to fear and then you give people a solution, then you get actually people to line up behind the danger control rather than the fear control. So in this case, it worked, but it's a very, every time now you see the terrorism alert going on, people just say, oh, whatever, it's another manipulated one. You don't know whether it's real or not. People don't know what to do. I mean, it's actually a really challenging one to get people now behind, on these sort of repeated instances. And so I think fear as a long-term motivator is going to be very tiring and very ineffective the longer we use it. I mean, we're not going to, if you tell someone, however much you diet, you're gaining weight, it's very hard to keep people at it. So, I mean, and the more you scare them, people will essentially go numb. So I think it might work sort of in the short term. I think it's very dangerous to rely on that in the long term. Now, in terms of what frames have worked, There is no one answer to that because, as I said, different things resonate with different people. And you mentioned this, like morals will get people motivated. Yes, some. You have the people, part of the evangelical community now talking about creation care. There's not a word of climate change in that. It's creation care, very motivating. It works for that community. I have people who come up to me and say, just the facts, ma'am. I don't want to hear any of that soft peddling stuff, whatever. I want the facts, I want the economics, I want to know whether this is politically advantageous. What motivates people will be different. And so you get some cities, they're very interested in the economic opportunity issues, the competitive issues. Some are totally driven by, there is a leadership vacuum at the federal level, and we are stepping into that vacuum, and we're being modeler. We model a positive response, and it works in the particular context. I cannot give you the one answer that will solve this issue. For some, it's energy cost and savings. Most of the cities that, signed up for, and Michelle knows this very well, people who signed up in cities for the climate protection campaign that ICLEI is promoting, most of them signed up because of energy and cost savings. That was their primary thing. Then there were other issues like, air quality locally will get better if we tackle pollution from cars and that kind of things. Health and life quality are very resonant things that hit something deep in people. So that tends to be a useful thing. What hasn't worked are purely scientific and purely environmental frames. Because you can so easily say, oh, well, another one of these green things or whatever from the elitist scientist. It's too narrow. People, environment typically isn't the voting issue. You can engage people much more on the economy, on the health, on education, on things that matter to them in their daily lives. So I would recommend that you don't lead with the scientific or the environmental if you want to frame this issue. It's a supportive one, I think. Have I talked to the states about communication strategies? No, but I do take speaking arrangements, so, if you're be happy to do that. But in the project that I reported on, we actually did involve a number of state officials, and local officials, and so there's some into that community, but I haven't talked to, someone like yourself, and so I'm happy to do that. And I'll just stop there.
Can I add something to that? Just one thing I wanted to add to something Susie just said about the response to terrorism and the sort of fear plus solution kind of overture that was made, and in fact got the many people in this country fully supportive and behind that policy. Some of you may have seen in the Washington Post about a week ago an editorial about the costs of the U.S. implementing the Kyoto Protocol versus the costs of the war in Iraq. And it's very, very interesting because about 5 years ago, maybe going back 10 years, there was a lot of modeling done to estimate what it would cost for the United States to ratify the Kyoto Protocol and meet the targets that were negotiated, 7% below 1990 numbers. And obviously a lot of assumptions and some guesswork that goes into that. But the numbers, if you look across the literature, $300 billion was probably the number. It would have cost the U.S. $300 billion to sign up to that protocol and meet the emissions reductions targets. And the arguments that you hear in the United States about not doing the Kyoto Protocol, there are two, and one of these prominent arguments is that it would undermine the U.S. economy, and there are all kinds of sort of statistical shenanigans about the number of people that would lose their jobs and the cost of GDP, and people standing in bread lines because we signed up to the Kyoto Protocol. But again, the cost estimate was $300 billion. That's roughly what the cost estimate was. It is now estimated that we will spend at least $300 billion on the war in Iraq, including all expenditures that have already been incurred and the ones that are coming in the next few years. And some have estimated that the Iraq war will go as high as $500 to $600 billion. So there's a point made in this Washington Post article, and I think it's very interesting that we could spend that much money and get the American people, behind this effort, and there are lives being lost as well. This economy has not been undermined. The U.S. economy is obviously people are not standing in bread lines because of the Iraq war. And people, of course, did put a lot of support behind it. So interesting that people in the scientific and environmental community could not sell climate change to the American public, even when the cost probably wouldn't have been that severe.
Okay. All right, we'll start some more questions. David? Is anyone here?
Hi, David Levy, UMass Boston. Question for all the panel, really, again about the framing and the economic framing versus other framings. So I've been part of an effort to try and frame climate measures, particularly RGGI, in terms of regional competitiveness. And we've got a really strong argument around Massachusetts that we've got a strong cluster of fuel cell energy companies, of solar companies, and yet the dominant discourse is mainstream economists who are doing this classical modeling where you presume that everything is already hunky-dory and perfect, so that any measures must have a real economic cost. And I was in a conversation with Marty Zimmerman, from Ford, who's now at Michigan, a couple of weeks ago, and these people can't conceive that any measures that tie your hand behind your back in any way could actually help a region. The idea, as the so-called Porter hypothesis, that you can stimulate a region's industry and then get out ahead because we would then be exporting. These arguments are very, very hard to make. Plus, the states don't invest in that kind of research. They were willing to spend a lot of money on the more conventional research and just a little bit for me to make a sort of a less conventional regional competitiveness argument. So, yeah, to some extent you have to tailor it. It's hard breaking through into that audience, and I'd be interested to hear how you do it. But then there's this sort of bigger question about, you listen to the way in which climate advocates are trying to frame it under the radar. Let's not ruffle feathers. Let's try and have a minimalist, incremental approach, low carbon price. And I can understand they think that they're being clever strategically. But my gut tells me actually there's something wrong with this, that maybe if you look at the framing, say, of the Apollo project, this will be national renewal, generate a lot of jobs, the new technology. Let's spend, the comparison with the war is a good one, let's spend $100 billion on this or that. My gut tells me that maybe if you set the bar higher and talk big, maybe that could have some movement rather than or moving in the smaller policy circles and thinking, should we have a $5 price or a $7 price, and a get-out clause and a safety cap and all these kinds of things, that maybe the larger scale economic discourse as well as the moral discourse might shift. So I'd be interested in that. Do we go the high road or the low road? So just one last thing about the framing. A key thing that theory tells us here, social movement theory, is that we need to build linkages with other movements as well, breaking it. And I mean, you look around here, it's primarily white, elitist. We have been labeled, part of the success of the counter movement is that we have been labeled as the pointy-headed East Coast latte drinking liberals, and and that's what loses Kerry and Gore elections. There's a way that, again, we have to break out and build linkages with the other movements so that the framing is broader. So I'll leave it there.
Okay, terrific. If you could just pass it down to the gentleman. Yeah, thanks.
Joe Duckert. My question actually is somewhat similar to David's, and it grows out of our discussion of Kyoto yesterday and the Kyoto targets, which I think almost everybody agrees now are not realistic. I probably wouldn't have brought it up, though, if Andrew had not said, does empirical cost data at state level spur the feds to action? And WRI apparently examined cases, couldn't find any in which that really happened, did in fact find a case where there had been overpromises and the feds went ahead and acted anyway. Which takes me back to something that Barry Rabe said in referring to RPS standards. He said, I'm not sure we're going to get to those numbers, but they're big numbers. So my question, addressed to all three, could be taken as moralistic or strategic. Should we make a real effort to tell the truth about what can be done? It makes a big difference. I think corn-based ethanol is a hoax on the farmers. I think cellulosic ethanol has real potential. But along about 2012 or 2015, I think the farmers are going to realize that while they had some good times, it really doesn't last. So is it worthwhile? Should we exaggerate the potential in order to get something done? In order to have the Congress pass legislation that would put more ethanol pumps around the country. When someone, I've forgotten, I can't go through my notes fast enough to remember who it was, somebody foresaw an argument, I guess it was Barry, between the solar people and the wind people. How should we react to the solar people saying they need special set-asides, even though their payoff is much more distant and is going to cost a lot more? It brings up the question of investment credits versus production credits. And it goes back also to telling the truth about the potential for renewable energy in the United States. We hear a lot about generating capacity, not as much about generating output. And you can play games with statistics. It's not quite intellectually honest. Is it worth taking that road, which I think we have taken, in order to accomplish the objective?
Okay, terrific. Why don't we take one more? The gentleman in the back.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Gary Briner from Brigham Young University. Question for both of you about cap and trade program. Barry, to what extent are cap and trade programs a part of RPS standards and also climate programs? Is everybody really thinking about some kind of trading program as part of meeting the goal for whether it's an RPS target or some other kind of climate greenhouse gas reduction target? And then for Susie, what problems or challenges do you see in terms of the implications of using emissions trading for the message? A long time ago, people were concerned that using emissions trading was really going to be difficult to sell to people because they saw that as buying the right to pollute. Is that still an issue in terms of the public message that's associated with emissions trading?
So why don't we get this final question, and then we'll give our panelists the opportunity to say, sir.
Thanks. This is Simon Donner from Princeton University. I'm just, this is my question is I just want to throw an idea out there and see what the panelists think. It's sort of in response both to your words and the things we heard yesterday. It strikes me, just based on the stories we got about how the Kyoto target was decided in Canada. Basically, Jean Chrétien, the Prime Minister, made a decision at the last minute based on sort of trying to outdo the U.S. and based on how Governor Schwarzenegger got to putting forth the climate action plan that has been put forth in California. It does seem that sort of personal, civic engagement and sort of does matter, because sometimes the decisions come down to just a personal decision that Governor Schwarzenegger had a friend that convinced him that this was important. And it's got me wondering, from everything we've put together, that it seems that the process that we go through is in communicating and getting some sort of action on climate change, it begins with the science, because although you don't want to dwell on the science too much, you need some rudimentary understanding before caring about this at all. And after that, it sort of moves to belief, and that the belief being that this is something we need to, for moral reasons, do something about, or I don't even really care about the quote-unquote moral reasons, but we should go ahead with this because it's a good idea and because the scientists tell us what's going to happen. That is technically still belief, if you think about it. But then after that, once you're sort of believing that we need to take, for moral reasons or whatever, take action on climate change, then it goes to economics. Then it says, oh, you know what, maybe there's a way to make some money off of this. And that's sort of the model I'm kind of seeing by putting everybody's talks together. I don't know whether that makes sense and whether the panelists would agree.
I'm gonna start.
All right, that's.
Yeah.
I'll take a couple of these. The issue, I want to sort of discuss the issue of incrementalism versus a big vision, together with the question that you raised about, shall we tell the truth? That's no small challenge. First of all, I would generally say that the truth will win out. So if you tell people an untruth or an incomplete truth, eventually all you do, you will undermine your credibility, and it's how you deal with that, obviously, and what you're left to do is I think, very challenging. So at the same time, what so often we have done, at least so far, is that we have told the scientific truth to the best way that we know it, which is a pretty gosh darn, difficult future.
I was really referring to economic truth more.
Yeah, interestingly enough, that is something that is much less questioned. I mean, the economic models that we have are going through far less not peer review, but far less scrutiny, public scrutiny than let's say what we have seen in the scientific debate about climate change, and economists would be the first ones to actually admit to that. But so what I'm saying here is that I think you're right in motivating people to take action. If we just keep telling them change the light bulb, and we're telling them at the same time this is the biggest problem society faces at this moment in time, there is a disconnect for people that is really hard to bridge. And so there's, not just myself, but others have said that we need to motivate people and really put in front of them, we're going to the moon. We have a big challenge in front of us, and that truly will stimulate, and you have to back that up with the kind of incentives and programs that actually get you to, get a clear signal that you should be investing in this and putting some thought into it and action into it. So I actually am very much in favor of having a big vision, because most likely we're kind of going to come under, under that in terms of the reality of the practicalities of it. So if we just start small, then maybe that doesn't work. But many, argue that the first few steps, and there's good psychological evidence for this too in terms of civic action, is when you get people to commit to a small step and they see it's not that painful, they're actually much more willing than if they hadn't done anything to commit to a yet bigger step and go further. And the same is actually true in a lot of, with local communities and businesses as well. So I think there's a strategic evaluation of maybe having a big vision but starting small, building the capacity, building the will to do that. And in terms of this telling the truth, I think if we don't very quickly move from telling the truth about how severe it is without telling people how we could get from here to there and what the pitfalls might be along the way, we will actually fail. I think, there's no point in giving people false hope about, we very well may fail pulling climate change or pulling ourselves together on climate change in time to avoid really dangerous impacts on many parts of the globe. So I think people are willing, and if you look at sort of people who are terminally ill and who get who have to deal with that, I mean, there's the typical sort of approach is you tell them how serious it is, you tell them what positive outcome there might be and how hard it is to achieve, but you tell them how you might get there, what the measures of improvement might be, and so on and so forth. And the same actually I think it will hold societally. We have to have a vision, tell them what the pathway might be and the challenges along the way. I'm not, just a quick answer to the cap and trade system, I'm actually not aware of any study that has looked at how to communicate that yet. I think people have already had a really tough time communicating renewable portfolio standards. But I think to the point of, does it just basically come across as giving people permission to pollute? I think what people have used is that it is, economically a much more viable way to get to pollution reductions, and the typical example with sulfur dioxide, is pulled in as a proof that this is actually, we've done this before, we can do it, so it's an encouraging kind of message. It hits at some of the economic concerns people have, and it's actually not been that problematic as far as I know, but that's more anecdotal than any study that I'm aware of.
I'll try to respond to several, but begin with this issue of accuracy and honesty, and perhaps weave back to a couple of the others. I think this is a very fair and an important question, and I think there are a couple of potential explanators for it. One is politics and political ambition. We heard about the Chrétien decision to beat the U.S. by 1 percentage point. Governor Schwarzenegger just decided that the 17% goal for renewable energy by, I believe, 2020 wasn't good enough, and the number should be 33%. There are a lot of governors who want to be president. And with former Governor Wilson staring at us, I would only note that as Mr. Bush approaches the end of his current term, we will have been governed in the U.S. for 28 of the last 32 years by individuals whose only elected prior service was at the state level. And we can already point to 2008, where on both the Republican and Democratic side, there could be some credible or non-credible folks who will argue that they kind of cracked the cosmic egg of climate change and did so for economic development purposes. So there is that political incentive, especially if you're talking about targets 2015, 2020, 2028, or yesterday, my goodness, 2050. Who's going to be alive in the California legislature, much less still involved at that time? So that's part of it. The second is, we're still at a very early stage of thinking about this. And so it really is hard to know. The question came up about BP yesterday. And where will BP be in 5 or 10 years? Will they be rewarded for all of their investments on renewables or not? There's that level of kind of market uncertainty and market unpredictability, especially when you go from the sort of broad modeling and estimations and do real policy. On the RPS piece, let me elaborate a little bit on that. I do think the majority of states are right now on track, but there are bumps in the road. When Massachusetts adopted its RPS, which is a pretty bold one, goes up about 0.5 point a year and then a percentage point a year. Well, the assumption was that you could pick up a lot of wind power from Cape Wind. No one anticipated the local civic response. No one anticipated an incredible coalition amongst Senators Kennedy, Warner, and Alexander, all of whom are property owners in Nantucket Sound, that would use federal policy levers to try to prevent massive wind power development from going forward in Nantucket Sound. Or that the possibilities of really significant development of biomass in Massachusetts, which is probably the second best alternative, would lead to a feeding frenzy, a year-long battle over regulatory kinds of issues. I just don't know that one could have foreseen that or anticipated. And going back to the questions of technological change and technological conversion, it really is hard to sort of know the capacity to bring on technologies, much less weave them through in a political system. So at one level, it's probably political hubris. But at another level, just like any kind of a market system, you have uncertainties and difficulties of predicting what the world's going to look like, and you're trying to hit some of those targets. With that, let me weave back to the RPS cap and trade question, because on the one hand, of course, there's commonalities and integration. At the same time, they're very, very different worlds. Very, very different worlds. In the U.S., in Canada to the extent these exist, in Australia, where they're beginning to emerge subnationally, and in the European Union. There's a real tension here. And there's a real danger, in theory, of scamming. Because if you make a shift from a thermal energy source to a renewable source, well, gee, can you get a cap and trade credit and a renewable energy credit in one state? And if you have interstate trading, can you scam the system so you could get 1 or 2 credits in, say, the Northeast, in Massachusetts, in Rhode Island, and Prince Edward Island has an RPS now, could you get a PEI credit and maybe even get a Kyoto benefit? This is incredibly difficult and incredibly complex. And if you think of the process of policing ozone and the chemical transformation there, where there it was relatively easy. This is just absolutely massive. And I think we're just in very early stages of thinking about this. The RPS trading issue. There's real reluctance to allow for double crediting. And as many cap and trade systems emerge, there's kind of pushback to allowing them to get credit under RPS provisions and RPS arrangements. And in fact, it plays out federally. I would argue the folks at RGGI are waving a flag saying, please, federal government, adopt us. Give us credit for early action. Let us get all the benefits of technology development, but make this a federal policy. Even though there's a strange kind of a disconnect, which to me was manifest when Senator Lieberman, the author of the McCain-Lieberman bill, came to Hartford 2 weeks before the RGGI meeting that took place and talked about the glories of a federal cap and trade strategy, but didn't even acknowledge that Connecticut was already basically doing cap and trade. There's a federal-state deep disconnect there. If you were to survey the state RPS people, and I've been doing this over the last year, many of them are not opposed to federal action, but they're nervous about it. They don't want to get burned. They think they're going to be net losers under the political calculation that will take place. And there's several reasons for this. We always hold out in the U.S. and internationally the SO2 trading experience is the be-all and end-all, the thing that proves credit trading always works. Well, if you look at the international experience with credit trading, it really is a little more of a mixed bag. And I would argue that, yes, the SO2 trading program of the 1990 Clean Air Act delivered a reduction in SO2 in dramatically successful economic terms, but the winners, the technological winners, were scrubbers, and the losers were renewable energy providers. There was huge political horse trading there, so the credits went much more heavily to scrubbers and high-tech sources to reduce SO2, whereas the credit value that was provided under the emissions trading system, this wonderful market-based, non-political system, really disadvantaged renewable energy providers. People at the state level who've been thinking about renewable energy for 10, 20, in some cases 30 years, public and private, remember that. And they're very nervous about any kind of a relationship. And so ironically, the RPS people are saying, we're a little nervous about a federal RPS. And we only want to consider it unless we are completely protected, our technology and our state economic development issues are emerging. And so I think that's part of an even further patchwork quilt, if you will, but may hopefully respond to a couple of the other issues and questions and suggest that within this area, you have policy subcommunities that on the one hand, yes, we're all concerned about climate change. But on the other hand, you have net winners and losers, whether it's private or public.
I'll be brief. I had a couple of thoughts about your question, David, about really trying to sell this policy and what the real costs are and whether or not you need to sort of go big picture rather than focus on the market prices. It's just a couple of things. The Renewable Energy Policy Project has done some research in this area on solar and other renewable energy technologies where they look at the value chain that goes into the manufacturing and assembly of these technologies, and then they compare the standard industrial code, companies that are registered with the Department of Commerce under standard industrial codes that actually fit those various segments of the value chain. And they actually came up with some data broken out by congressional districts that said, your congressional district has X number of companies that employ X number of people that can manufacture the components for this technology. My understanding is from the people at the Solar Energy Industries Association, this was extraordinarily effective, working with specific congressmen, in particular House Ways and Means Chairman from Southern California. Come on, he's leaving.
Thomas.
Thank you, Thomas. They went to Thomas with this data. He agreed with it, and that actually helped in the Energy Policy Act of 2005 to get the commercial tax credit for solar energy installations, which the industry thinks is going to be a big boon to its sales. So one point there. Another point, too, is to look at what I would call bottom-up experience within industries about what the costs have actually been and the financial returns have been to these companies in either investing in new technology development or actually employing new technologies. And we have a representative from BP here today. My understanding is that they claim to have saved hundreds of millions of dollars, with $400 million, $600 million by virtue of their greenhouse gas reduction program. And that so the projects that they implemented to reduce greenhouse gases actually had a lot of economic benefits, and the company's better off for it. And those efficiency gains and reductions in natural gas leaks and things like that. So there is some bottom-up industry experience that actually refutes the economic modeling that says, retail electricity prices are going to go up by 2 cents a kilowatt hour, and everybody's really going to get hit hard here. And then, also I think with some of the historic experiences with the emissions trading programs like SO2 and NOx, you find that the modeling that was done that was projecting the costs going forward did a very poor job of calculating the rate of technology change, and as a result, overestimated what the cost would be. So 3 points of attack you might want to work. You might want to think about when trying to sell these policies, and then lastly, going to your question, which is related to all this, should we tell the truth about what's economically feasible? I think the immediate answer is you always should. But then I guess you get into this as you indicated, sort of value-laden judgment call about do the means justify the ends or the ends justify the means. I know a really great and very savvy communicator who always says to me, in an issue like this, you have to have a competing myth that trumps the myth that your opposition is trying to sell. And so on climate change, there are people who are motivated to try to conflate this issue or lead the public to believe that it's enormously expensive and that we can't do it. We have to recognize that. We have to recognize that there are people who, in fact, are not operating on grounds of truth and honesty. And they create myths that can be sold to the public very easily. And then the question is, do the people who want to see, people who believe that there's a real problem here and want to see progressive and strict climate policies in place, should they be creating competing myths that actually trump these other myths in order to get the public bought in? It's a value call. I personally wouldn't want to have to go down that road. But the competing myth that you see in play is that, in fact, this isn't expensive. We can do this. If we do these policies, they pay for themselves. We get innovation. We get new technology jobs. It helps with energy diversification and energy security. There's all kinds of co-benefits with clean air. There really is no cost here. I don't believe that. There is no free lunch here. There probably, at the end of the day, there is a cost with climate policies. And I prefer to go the route of honesty, but we do have to recognize that it might be sort of unilateral disarmament.
Okay, terrific. Well, it's been an excellent session. I want to bring it to a close. Tell everyone we'll reconvene at 11:15, and won't you join me in thanking our panelists? Also, just a quick reminder that after the next panel, we urge you to stick around for informal discussion and networking with a lunch that will be just outside the room.
Hi, Amy. Nice to see you again. How are you?